It was only a couple of weeks ago that we reviewed the Shogun, and now we're already taking a look at another bread and butter paddle, this time the Fat Boy. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. Bread and Butter is not screwing around this summer. They've released two top-end paddles within the space of 1 month that are targeting two very different player types. It's pretty crazy considering they basically only came into prominence last year with the Filth, and seeing them build and even pave the way with some really unique stuff is awesome, and I just hope it keeps going into the future. The Fat Boy is totally different to anything I've tried from them before, and honestly pretty different to most paddles coming out nowadays, but I've got a feeling it's going to be super popular. Now, of course, before we get into this review, let me remind you that any of the paddles we talk about on this channel you can check out on our website, racketsandrunners.ca. Also, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me and the store on Instagram, and let me know in the comment section what you want me to cover next. So the Fat Boy, as the name would suggest, it's a wide body paddle, which kind of goes against the grain for what's become popular in pickleball in the last couple of years, but we've also been seeing a trend towards these shorter wide paddles in the last couple of months. The R2 shape from Rhombus, the Mach 2 shape from Valair, the Scorpius, the J3K, they've all been helping to repopularize this shape recently, but admittedly the Fat Boy is quite different. Just by looking at it, you can tell it doesn't have the same silhouette. The main difference here is that it's a more traditional wide body paddle because it doesn't have the same long handle that these do. The paddle face itself comes down a little lower, it's also a little rounder down there, and the handle is only 5.3 inches long instead of 5.5. All of these things have an important effect on its playability, which we'll get to in a second. Before that though, let's finish up with the specs. It's 16 inches long, it weighs 8.1 ounces, and has a 16mm core. It's made from a thermoformed unibody construction with a blended T700 carbon and Kevlar weave. It also has a swing weight of 110 and a twist weight of 7.19. Now I know I haven't talked about twist weight that much on this channel, and part of that is because I get caught up in this idea that everyone's going to customize their paddle and that's going to make stock swing weight moot, but here it's very important. The high twist weight goes hand in hand with this wider shape, and that's at the core of all of the Fat Boy's playability, so let's get into it. As usual, we start with paddle feel and sweet spot, and by the way, I think you guys like the rating system I used on the J3K and J7K review, so I'll do that again here. The combination of the thermoformed carbon and Kevlar weave gives the Fat Boy this slightly muted, almost artificially soft feel to it. I think what it is that the plush Kevlar and then the more raw, firm carbon almost overpower each other, which is why the feel is a little less natural, I guess you could say. Of course, as we've come to expect with paddles that have any amount of Kevlar, it also has some of that adaptiveness where the paddle firms up as you hit harder. It keeps that artificial feel even on harder shots. As it firms up, it creates a sharper pop, and when combined with the muted feel, it actually comes off a bit metallic. Now, I don't want anyone to hear the words artificial and metallic and think that that's automatically a bad thing. I was a little bit surprised with the feel because I have come to expect Kevlar to be more plush on the Honolulu pickleball paddles I've been testing recently, but muted is definitely not bad. It's actually quite similar to the feel on the Pickleball Apes Proline Energy S, which a lot of people like, and that makes a lot of sense because that paddle also has a blended weave of carbon and Kevlar. There really isn't one answer for which feel is better, muted or non-muted. Paddles with feedback are great, but feedback is a double-edged sword. It's positive when you make good contact, but negative when you don't. A lot of players like a muted feel because it smooths out the feedback around the paddle so that there isn't such a stark drop-off in playability if you're not making perfect contact. It effectively expands the sweet spot, at least the perceived sweet spot, and on the Fat Boy that was definitely the right way to go because this sweet spot is absolutely massive. It's probably not all that surprising when you look at this thing. The top sheet, the big face, the super high twist weight, all those things add up to making this one of the biggest and most stable sweet spots I've ever tested. It's way more forgiving than these other wide body paddles I was talking about earlier because of the way the paddle face comes down a little lower and is rounder around the edges here. It's a longer sweet spot and it's also a little bit wider. So I'm going to give it a 95 for sweet spot and a 91 for feel. Now that might surprise some of you who know how much I like good feel, but I think the muted feel here works really well with that bigger sweet spot. To me, Bread and Butter nailed it with the Fat Boy in making it a more forgiving paddle, and those feel and sweet spot characteristics also play a huge role in giving it the control profile that it has. The Fat Boy is a control-oriented paddle. That's by far its most outstanding characteristic, which is a bit different to these new era wide-body paddles with the long handles I keep referring to. Every design element here makes it one of those elite turn-your-brain-off in the soft game type of paddles where you are unlikely to mess up your shot, but if you do, the paddle will probably bail you out. The sweet spot size and stability already gives you a massive margin for error, and the fact that it's shorter makes it easy to maneuver to aim where you want to place your ball. The muted feel extends dwell time, which gives you a split second longer to guide the ball, and I was not expecting that when I saw that it was thermoformed and 50% carbon. The Kevlar is definitely doing its job, and I was particularly impressed with its performance on drops and resets because those are harder than dinks, and yet they were an absolute breeze with this paddle. Dinking was also great, don't get me wrong, but slightly less impressive because it's an easier shot than random drops and resets, so you don't really need your paddle to help you out as much. So yeah, this is one of the best control paddles I've tested. Its softness is more along the lines of what you get with non-thermoform paddles like the Vanguard Control Epic, but to me it's even better than those because its sweet spot is more stable and forgiving. I'm going to give it a 95 for soft control. I'll talk about controlled spin shots later, but those will factor into spin and not the control rating. Considering how good this paddle is in the control game, its power is also excellent, in large part thanks to that adaptive feel that's almost become a must if you want to sell in 2024. The paddle firms up and pops the ball off with a bit more venom as you hit harder, which is not something you get with traditional control paddles, but I do have to say it is a notch under what I get with something like the J3K. The muted feel does limit the amount of energy the carbon and Kevlar can apply onto the ball, at least compared to those paddles I've been testing recently. Obviously, they're still doing something here. Kevlar probably most of the work since it's the main adaptive material here. It's not pushing the boundaries for power, but that's totally fine. Lower power is a trade-off that players who are interested in this paddle will be more than willing to make because, again, it's a control paddle. The fact that it even has a bit of extra oomph is already a bonus. Now, between pop and power, pop is significantly better, which is logical because this shorter shape is easier to flick and generate paddle head speed with on shorter strokes. I was definitely able to hit some difficult offensive volleys with this paddle. I couldn't instantly end the point the way I could with foam-filled paddles, but I could generate enough pop to push my opponent around and take control of the rally that way. Now, of course, what you gain in maneuverability with this shorter shape, you lose in leverage, which negatively affects its power. It doesn't respond that well to tennis-style drives, but again, that's just not what it's made for. Some players drive to get themselves out of sticky situations and away from the baseline. Other players prefer to drop and reset the point. The Fat Boy is made for those of you who prefer to drop and reset. So in terms of pop, I'm going to give it an 89, and for power, I'm going to give it an 81. And on a control paddle like this, pop is so much more important than power. You're looking for control to get up to the net, then pop to finish the points off. You're never really going to be bashing at the ball and using full power, so it doesn't matter that this paddle doesn't have that much power. Now we're going to talk about spin, which is admittedly the Fat Boy's biggest weakness, but it's certainly not bad. It's not up there with the best of the best spin paddles, but compared to other paddles in its category like the Vanguard Control Epic, it's much better, so it's more so a matter of perspective. Remember, this is a control paddle, not a power paddle, and spin is way more important on those because you need a way to control the power. Now there are a couple of reasons why spin isn't top tier on the Fat Boy, starting with the top sheet. It's definitely not the most spin-friendly out there. Compared to full Kevlar paddles, the Shogun, even some of the most spin-friendly full carbon paddles, I didn't have the same purchase over the ball. When I really wanted to carve into it, it almost felt like the ball was slipping off the paddle face, which ended up making me less confident for spin on drives and spin in the soft game. I really didn't care about spin on drives, it's not made for that, but I was a little bit disappointed with its performance in the soft spin game because that's one of the areas where these shorter paddles I've been testing recently are absolutely elite. I think the lack of grip and purchase over the ball plays a big role in this having less spin, but there is another important issue here, this paddle's shape. I'm going to show you again how different it looks to these short paddles with long handles. This is clearly a clunkier paddle, which makes it less complementary to proper spin technique. High spin is generated when a player uses wrist lag to scoop and shape the ball as they bring the paddle face through contact. Paddles like the J3K and any version of the R3 complement that to a T, but the Fat Boy shape is slower to bring through contact. Now you might be thinking, well, how about elongated paddles? Those are even slower and nobody's complaining about a lack of spin there. Well, the difference with elongated paddles is that yes, they may be slower, but the longer shape also provides so much leverage over the ball that it makes up for their lack of whippiness. Striking the right balance of paddle head speed and paddle leverage is crucial to complementing proper spin technique, and this paddle isn't quite up there with the best in that regard. Now this high twist weight also has a slightly negative effect on how much you can scoop at the ball during dwell time. This scooping motion is key for spin, and it involves twisting the paddle around the ball. Naturally, if the paddle's twist weight is harder, that's going to make it relatively harder to twist the paddle around the ball. To be honest, all these things are pretty minor by themselves, but when you add them up, the final product is a paddle that's not that competitive with the elite in terms of spin. I still want to make it clear that spin is definitely not bad though. Reviewing in 2024 involves so much nitpicking because these companies are making such good paddles, and you can definitely still hit with spin here. I'm going to give it an 80 for spin and remind you once again that this is a control-oriented paddle, so a lowish grade here is not nearly as important as it would be on something very power-oriented. So I think I've made it pretty clear that this is a control paddle, and obviously I've said some good things about control on power and spin paddles before, but this is a bit different. Those paddles are good for control either because they have a bit of softness, really good consistency, and usually both, but they don't help you in the soft game the way this one does. This is a paddle that's there to make the soft game as easy as possible, and that's very important in pickleball because that's still where there's the biggest skill gap. I don't think the highest level of players will go for this paddle because they don't necessarily need that help in the soft game, but I do think a lot of players should look at the Fat Boy because it'll make it easier and that could win you a lot of games. I think it's going to be super popular because it's so user-friendly and control-oriented that it's a bit of a gem in such a power and spin-focused market. With that said, that is going to be the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that if you do want to demo the Fat Boy, you can come visit us in store, and if you want to buy it, you can go online at racketsandrunners.ca.